This here is a GTX 660 Ti, which a lot of you probably think is too old at this point. I'm not gonna lie, I definitely thought the same thing too. But after benchmarking 10 games, this GPU that you can find for like 40 to 50 bucks is actually a very solid option for your next used gaming PC build. Let's have a look. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be checking out the GTX 660 Ti and benchmarking 10 games to see if it's worth your money here in 2018. And if you're new here and you want to see more PC hardware or PC building videos, then hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But yeah, let's check this thing out. Before getting into the benchmarks, I promise I'll keep this intro very short. I just want to quickly talk about what exactly this GPU is that we're looking at today. This specific model is the MSI TwinFrozer 2GB model, which is rocking a core clock of 1019 MHz and a boost clock of 1097 MHz. For this video, I actually did overclock it a little bit. I got about an extra 50 MHz on the core clock and 200 MHz on the memory clock. As you can see from these Firestrike results, this overclock increased our graphics score by about 6%, and you could honestly probably squeeze a little more out of it if you're more patient than I am. Also, be aware that because of older cards not being very power efficient, the 660 Ti does have a recommended minimum power supply rating of 450 watts. One more thing that I want to mention is that I personally did find this graphics card used on Mercari for $40 shipped, and I found it on eBay anywhere from 40 to 50, and this means that this is a direct competitor to the very popular 750 Ti that I know a lot of you are rocking in your builds. The build that we'll be testing in today is the exact build that I actually just featured last week in our baller $450 build guide. Make sure you check out that video if you haven't, and the only real difference here is the actual GPU. This build is rocking an Intel Xeon X3470, which boosts up to 3.6 GHz and 16 GB of DDR3 RAM. And finally, if you're unaware about these Xeon processors and it's not something that you're used to seeing, hold off on any thought about a potential bottleneck until you see the benchmarking results with the Assassin's Creed Origins game. This GPU and CPU are actually a pretty solid combo if you're thinking about picking them up. The first game up in my benchmarking run was Fortnite. How could you possibly not start with Fortnite at this point? And here I tried something new by using some 1080p Pro settings that I found on a website called Gaming Scan. A ton of you have been asking me to use the Pro settings in some of these games, so let me know what you think. And with these settings, the 660 Ti could crank out a very impressive 132 FPS. The next game up was Counter-Strike Global Offensive. This one I also used some Pro settings I found, which was pretty much low settings for everything except for high textures, and with this in 1080p we averaged yet another solid FPS average of 139. Rainbow Six Siege followed after that, and with yet again some Pro settings. These ones were mostly medium settings with just a couple of tweaks, and in 1080p we got an average FPS of 86. Keep in mind that this was using the built-in benchmarking tool and not an actual online game. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds followed up next, and in 1080p and straight medium settings I managed to crank out what I thought was a very impressive 62 FPS average. PUBG is definitely more CPU dependent compared to most, but it was still nice to see above that 60 FPS mark. Next up I fired up Rocket League. I didn't really find Pro settings, but I'm sure they're out there, so let me know down in the comment section about that. And in 1080p with quality settings I got an average of 170 FPS. You could crank the settings up a bit more if you wanted to for this one. Grand Theft Auto 5 was up next. This is the last of the non-2017/2018 games, by the way. And here in 1080p with normal settings and the softest shadows I got an FPS average of 103. Getting into the newer and way tougher to run games, No Man's Sky was the first game that I had to crank the resolution down to 720p, and with this resolution and low settings I got an average FPS of 57. Keep in mind that for this one I definitely was going for that 60 FPS mark, and if you rather see a higher resolution I got right around 30 FPS in 1080p in low settings. The very tough to run Assassin's Creed Origins was next, and with the in-game benchmarking tool in 720p and very low settings I got an average of 46 FPS. Take a look in the top left hand corner at the GPU and CPU usage. This pretty much showcases just how good of a combo the Xeon X3470 and GTX 660 Ti are if you were thinking about picking both of them up. Next up was another very tough Ubisoft game to run, Far Cry 5, and in 720p resolution again, but with low settings I got just above that 60 FPS mark. As most of you guys know at this point, getting above 60 FPS in Far Cry 5 no matter what the resolution is a pretty legit feat. And finally, the last game that I tested was the brand new Monster Hunter World. I actually did a full benchmarking with budget graphics card video on this one, and in 900p with low settings, I got an average FPS of 42. Keep in mind that 1080p was definitely playable around the high 30s, as even though this game is tough to run, the FPS numbers always stay pretty consistent. Well, there you have it. That wraps up my benchmarking video for the GTX 660 Ti here in 2018. I think it's safe to say that if you're putting together a gaming PC with a 750 Ti and you happen to find a better deal on an older 660 Ti, you can go with that one instead. Now feel free to head on over to one of these two videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit that subscribe button because next week we have more builds and benchmarks. You don't want to miss those videos.